Hi, everybody. Welcome to Alistair MacIntyre, The Virtues, the Unity of a Human Life, and the Concept of a Tradition. Get some notes here. Okay, Alistair MacIntyre, born 1929, and as of the recording of this lecture, still alive in his 90s. It's a couple in a row that are old. Scottish philosopher. He's obviously a 20th century philosopher, and so he synthesizes philosophy from a range of its history. So he's definitely one of those philosophers who pays attention to this idea of philosophy as a history of ideas. I talked about that way back in my What is Philosophy lecture. And he in particular is especially interested in and inspired by a lot of the ancient philosophy. For him, especially ancient Greek philosophy, Plato, Aristotle. He specializes in ethics with an attention to our theme of the good life. He really is kind of talking, he'll use like kind of that phrase in here. And there's a heavy influence from Aristotle, especially all that stuff about virtue. So you might want to go back and refresh your memory about some of that stuff. But for Aristotle, notice he kind of took that. And like Noddings last time, this agent-based approach to ethics. We're talking about character, moral character. And for Noddings, obviously, that was in terms of caring and caring relationships. For MacIntyre, that's really the idea of the virtues. And he is thinking about Aristotle's ideas of virtues. Currently a professor at Duke University. I can't say that apparently. A little bit more about the text here. So yeah, there's a ton of stuff there that some of the earlier things do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So I don't want to repeat all that stuff, but worth reviewing some of Aristotle's stuff on virtue and Nodding stuff on agent-based ethics and such. Okay, so these are selections from a book that he writes called After Virtue, written in 1981, published in 1981. In this book, he tries to address some of the difficulties that he sees with modern ethical and political debates. And the thing about those is that a lot of the times people think there's something kind of unsolvable about them. So you think about like really difficult moral and political issues, and it just seems like people have really strong feelings and opinions about it, but there doesn't ever seem to be any sort of, coming together on a lot of these issues. And so they're just kind of, they seem unsolvable. Like, well, there's never going to be a right answer. And he thinks that's only the case because we've lost some important concepts, that the modern approach to ethics has left aside some important ancient ideas in ethics. And in particular, he argues that we need to recover some of these older ways of thinking about ethics, especially the virtues, Aristotle especially for him. And that a lot of this will help with problems that arise from what he wants to call a lack of unity of the human life. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is. But just briefly, the idea that each of us is sort of a fragmented person. We don't really have a good sense of ourselves as a complete, whole, unified human being. And that's because he wants to argue of the lack of the virtues, of Aristotle-type virtues. And so what we need to do is kind of help reunify human life, and that we can do this primarily through a notion of narrative. That if we can think about human life as a kind of a narrative, and especially the related notion of a tradition, then we will be able to better see our lives as unified wholes, see ourselves as unified wholes. We'll be better able to have a sense of Aristotle-type virtues. And then maybe that would kind of bring us together and help us solve some of those apparently unsolvable issues. So with that, he jumps kind of right into things. And again, like the last one, this seems like a lot, but it's actually, some of it connects together and it's pretty straightforward. So I'll take a few minutes to write down some things, just give you the whole thing here. Okay, so right off the bat on page 294, he wants to talk about some of the obstacles to the unity of a human life. Like, why is it that we feel like these kind of fragmented persons? Why don't we think of ourselves as whole, complete, unified human beings? And there's a couple of things there. On 294, he talks about certain social obstacles to the unity of a human life. And so he kind of says this right at the beginning here, right? Just a couple of lines down. There are two kinds of obstacles, social and one philosophical. The social obstacles derive from the way in which modernity partitions each human life into a variety of segments, each with its own norms and modes of behavior. So what does that mean exactly? Well, according to MacIntyre, the reason I have trouble thinking of myself as a whole human being is that modern societies provide these social obstacles to that. Modern life tends to actually break itself up into lots of different separate areas. And then I tend to define myself differently in those different areas without any sense of all of those things having anything in common. So for example, one of the common examples he talks about is stuff like the way that we separate work life from kind of personal life. So it depends on the jobs that you've had, but I think most of us have that experience of sometimes feeling like we're a different person at work than we are at home. So I am very much a different person as a professor in the company of my students in a classroom than I am when I'm at home with my wife and my cats. I swear a lot less in the classroom, for example, than I do when I'm at home. And that's good. I mean, it's appropriate that there be some different standards there, but his point is that there's nothing that unifies that. And so I start to think of myself as two different people. There's the work me and there's the home me. And that's just one example. There's other ways that he talks about we kind of break life up. We can do this during the course of a life by breaking it up into different sort of periods of life, like childhood, adulthood, old age, that we really do kind of think of people as being very different people at different ages, or at least within certain age ranges, ourselves and others. So like when you look at yourself in those like really little kid pictures, like, okay, yeah, in some sense that's you, but you're both like physiologically and psychologically so different now than you were then that it's almost like different people, right? Obviously, there's some commonalities. You might still see a physical resemblance, but hopefully you've developed and improved much more psychologically, emotionally, and so forth than when you were, say, 3 years old, right? And then so too, we tend to do that with people when they hit old age. This is something that's kind of related to this idea of ageism. People really stop seeing old people as people in a way that it's easier for them to do that if you're talking about them as just sort of younger adults. Right? So when young people think of old people as being kind of weird and different, they stop thinking of them as being people in some sense. And then again, maybe because of the rise of social media, this happens a little bit more. When you see, your grandparent post some pictures of when they were 23 on Facebook or something like that, and you're like, wow, look at, granddad's so different then, right? That's kind of the point though, right? You kind of fail to recognize, yeah, that old person was a younger person once and still had all these hopes and dreams and things like that. So we're broken into lots of different little parts in life at any particular time over the course of life, and there doesn't seem to be anything that brings all that together. On 294, he also talks about these philosophical obstacles. I don't want to go into that too much because it gets kind of complicated, but he talks about this idea that there's this philosophical notion of a basic action. For our purposes, just related to that discussion about action-based versus agent-based approaches to ethics that we talked about with Noddings, that modern ethics tends to focus on actions. What's the right thing to do? What's the rule to follow? And doesn't think about the kind of person that's performing it. And what he kind of wants to argue is that that tends to make us start to think of ourselves as being nothing more than a random collection of lots of different actions. And he kind of relates that to the Jean-Paul Sartre stuff. Again, this gets a little technical, and I don't want you to worry about it too much. But his major point is that there's really no room to talk about virtues unless you can talk about the agent, the person, the character that they have. And that's, again, it just kind of goes back to that agent versus action based. So I guess the really simple summary of the philosophical obstacles would come down to this idea that modern ethics focuses too much on actions and not enough on agents. It's the agent-based ethics where you actually get virtue theory, like Aristotle and such, like we talked about that time. And so that's his claim then on 296, that the unity of a human life requires the unity of genuine virtues, Aristotelian type virtues. And so if we're going to be a whole person, we need this concept of virtue. Okay. Now on 296, he kind of seems to change the subject there a little bit. And he wants to say that let's think about the idea of actions for a minute so that we can maybe see what's wrong with just thinking about things in this very specific action-based kind of way. And one of the things that he wants to point out on 296 and 297 is that actions can be described very differently, very variously, depending on, well, various things, right? So he uses this example, the last paragraph on 296, where a couple lines down, to the question, what is he doing? The answers may, with equal truth and appropriateness, be digging, gardening, taking exercise, preparing for winter, pleasing his wife. So what has he got in mind here? Suppose, you're taking a walk and you see somebody out in the backyard doing some stuff. And you're talking with somebody on your cell phone, let's say, and you say, oh yeah, I see a guy out in his yard, and the person on your cell phone who can't see what's going on says, oh, okay, what's that person doing? There are a whole bunch of totally correct but very different ways that you might describe what that person is doing. And the reason for this is that we can't really make sense of what the person is doing without the context of the setting and his intention in that setting. And so this is what he goes on to say there on 297, right? The top paragraph there, last couple of sentences there, or last full sentence. We cannot, that is to say, characterize behavior independently of intentions. And we cannot characterize intentions independently of the setting, which make those intentions intelligible both to agents and to others. And then the next paragraph, I use the word setting here as a relatively inclusive term, a couple lines down, but it is central to the notion of a setting, as I am going to understand it, that a setting has a history. All right, so that's a lot of stuff. So what's going on there? Well, think back to our example. We see somebody doing something. Our friend on the cell phone says, what is that person doing? I could describe it a lot of different ways. They'd all be correct, but why would I choose one or the other? Well, I have to make sense of the action that I see. I have to make it intelligible. And that intelligibility requires that I understand his intentions. What does he think he's doing? And in order to understand that, I need a little bit larger context of the setting that he's in. Is this his home or not? Does he live with other people? And for that, a setting too requires some notion of the history of that setting, not just what's going on right this second, but what's been going on for a while now. So to bring this back to the concrete example, if he's somebody who lives by himself and really enjoys gardening and spends a lot of time watching gardening shows and hangs out on the internet and talks in internet discussion forums about gardening and so forth, and has decided that he wants to dig a garden, then what I would say is, oh, this guy is gardening. That would be the most appropriate way to make what he's doing intelligible, given his intention. What does he think he's doing? Starting a garden. Given the setting, he lives alone, so he needs hobbies in order to make his life interesting. And the history, he's been learning about this stuff from other people on the internet, etc. Right? On the other hand, I might equally correctly describe what he's doing as getting some exercise. Again, if I'm going to make sense of it in that sense, if it's going to be intelligible to me to describe his action as taking exercise, again, I need to know what his intention is. I want to get outside, get some fresh air, get some activity, burn some calories, etc. And again, I need to know the setting and its history. He goes to a doctor regularly and has been each year for a while now, and his physical exams are not coming back very good. It could be pleasing his wife. It could be just that he lives with someone and his wife has been bothering him to get out and do his chores. And so what I really want to do is make sure that my wife is happy. So I'm going to get outside and do those chores, etc., etc. So he talks about this. Another example he uses, the second paragraph of 298, if somebody asks the question, this is just a second example to make the same point, what is he doing? Somebody might equally say writing a sentence, finishing his book, contributing to the debate on the theory of action, trying to get tenure. He's thinking of himself in his office typing at the computer. Again, those are all equally valid arguments in the, not valid arguments, valid descriptions of his behavior in the abstract. But to really make it intelligible, I need to know his intention, the setting, the history of it. So it could be he's just publishing because he's really interested in this stuff, or it could be because he's coming up for tenure and he needs a certain amount of publications before he'll get that. And so even the idea, he says, of a basic action requires this idea that they're not just sort of separate things, but they require a certain kind of context for intelligibility. And notice too, on page 300, he says, intelligibility is required for accountability, that we can't even hold someone accountable for their behavior without being able to make sense of what they're doing. This is that first paragraph, the first half of it. The importance of the concept of intelligibility is closely related to the fact that the most basic distinction of all embedded in our discourse and our practice in this area is that between human beings and other beings. Human beings can be held to account for that of which they are the authors. Other beings cannot. Right? So we hold human beings responsible for their behavior in a way that we don't other animals, because we can make sense of what they're doing by thinking about their intentions, the setting, the social context. Well, what did you think you were doing, right? Whereas I think he's arguing animals just operate in this kind of instinctual way where it doesn't really make sense to talk about intentions or social context or histories or things like that. Right? So really we have to make sense of people's actions if we're going to say they're responsible or accountable for them. On page 300, he talks about this example. This one always cracks me up. It's the last full paragraph. I am standing waiting for a bus, and the young man standing next to me suddenly says, the name of the common wild duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. Okay, like one of those Latin classification names, right? Okay, that's really weird, right? Imagine you're standing there at the bus stop and somebody comes up and says this to you. And so this is another example. Like, notice it's not that I'm having any trouble on a surface literal level of understanding what he's saying. If I understand the language, then I understand he's giving me the formal Latin classification for the common wild duck. But I can't make that action, I can't really explain what he's doing without making it intelligible. And for that, again, I need intention, setting, history. And he gives, some different examples there. It could be that he's mistaken me for someone else, that he got into a conversation with somebody and like he's a bird watcher and somebody else was talking about bird watching. And for some reason they were having trouble remembering the classification for wild ducks. And he said, oh, I'll look it up and I'll tell you tomorrow. Okay, well, that makes sense, right? We've got the intention, the setting, the history. On the other hand, it could be like he's a Soviet spy. This was written in 1981, so there were still Soviet spies then. And he thinks I'm his contact, and that's like the code phrase. The name for the wild duck is Histrionicus, Histrionicus, Histrionicus. And I'm supposed to say the eagle flies at midnight or something like that. Right? Or another one that he says that kind of cracks me up. It could be that he's been seeing a psychologist for social anxiety, and the psychologist is trying to help, but not being very specific and saying, you need to talk to people more. Just just start talking to like some strangers at the bus stop. And the fellow asks, well, what should I say? And the psychologist very unhelpfully answers, oh, anything at all. It doesn't matter. Well, not anything at all, right? Because that's going to weird people out if there's no other context there. Right? So again, we kind of need all of this stuff. Right? Now, part of what this is showing here is where this idea of narrative comes in. That on 301, he starts talking about this, the next to last paragraph. The use of the words such as tragic, comic, and farcical is not marginal to such evaluations. We allocate conversations to genres just as we do literary narratives. Indeed, a conversation is a dramatic work, even if a very short one, in which the participants are not only actors but also joint authors, working out in agreement or disagreement the mode of their production. Right? So he's saying here that these conversations, like the wild duck conversation, it's literally a kind of a narrative. And he means narrative in the literary sense, a story. And he means that in kind of the literature sense of that. It's like a little story that you'd read, like a short story, or a play that you would see. This was a couple people acting and having some dialogue, right? And we could describe it as sort of dramatic if it's the spy example, or farcical if it's just that his psychologist gave him some really unhelpful advice, right? But those are literary genres. So we are already applying this idea of seeing life and people and their actions and their interactions as narratives, as stories, right? And what he wants to claim here is that life is a kind of a series of enacted narratives. Narratives are not just limited to literature itself, but to life. And he means this very literally now at this point. We're not just saying life is like a story. We're saying life is literally a story. The things that you say about a story, you also say about life. Right? So he says this, kind of at the bottom, no, excuse me, the top of 302, first full paragraph. I am presenting both conversations in particular, then, and human actions in general as enacted narratives. And then the next paragraph down uses this idea that human lives are understood in the context of a set of narrative histories. Last couple lines of that second full paragraph. It is because we all live out narratives in our lives, and because we understand our own lives in terms of narratives, that we live out the form of narrative that is appropriate for understanding the actions of others. Stories are lived before they are told, except in the case of fiction. So this is one of those things, I mean, be careful, because people often use that cliche that your life is kind of like a story, and it's easy to misunderstand what he's saying here. He's not saying life is like a story. Life is literally a story. It has characters and dialogue and genres like comedy or tragedy and so forth. And so it's really, he goes on to say that we need to kind of identify what is, at least in general terms, the genre of a life in order to make sense of a life. That we need to identify the genre, the narrative history, in order to make a life intelligible and to be able to assess it. Because we aren't just sort of actors, but we're also authors, both in our own stories and that of others. And an action is just a particular moment in some possible or actual history. You can't think about actions as these weird little separate things. Think about, again, a story has a plot. A plot is a series of actions and events. That's literally what goes on in a human life. And he uses this phrase on 306. I've been summarizing a little bit. But on 306, just kind of jumping forward there a bit. That very last paragraph. A central thesis then begins to emerge. Man is, in his actions and practice, as well in his fictions, essentially a storytelling animal. Right? That this kind of comes back to that question again of what makes humans different from other animals. And what he wants to say, it's because we tell stories. But not just the people who write books. Each and every one of us is constantly telling a story, creating a story, the story of our life, which we are writing in real time. We are both writing and acting out in real time. And think about this, this notion of intelligibility. We can't make sense of our actions, our lives, our personalities, our interactions with others without constantly telling ourselves little stories. So think about that time you had that argument with somebody, and then later you're still mad and you're practicing your comebacks in the mirror. When you tell other people about like why you're doing that, your roommate comes in and sees you doing that, what are you doing? You tell them the story of the argument. And I use the word story there because if you're honest with yourself, you're not just relating a bunch of random things that happened. You're writing this little drama, this little mini play of what happened, and probably not being entirely honest about it. It was totally the other person's fault, and you were totally great and rational the whole time, right? Right? Yeah, not probably really. A little bit of fiction there, right? Biographical fiction. But we do that to kind of justify and understand our own behavior, right? We need to make our own behavior intelligible and the behavior of other people intelligible in order to hold ourselves and others accountable or to try to get out of being accountable for our behavior, right? And so that means we really do have this kind of narrative concept of the self. It kind of says this on, excuse me, 308 here. Right. And it's really the first couple of really the whole page. So let me summarize there. But the first full paragraph, what the narrative concept of selfhood requires, and goes on to talk about this. But basically what he wants to say is that having this sort of narrative conception of the self means thinking of myself as the subject of my story, but also a part of the stories of other people's lives. That our lives are a bunch of interlocking narratives. And so that means we can start to see our life as a whole, as being unified by seeing it as a narrative. So, I mean, think about a novel that you read. It's not just a bunch of random events, even if it sometimes seems like that. Once you go into I'm reading a novel mode, you're not going to say, oh, this is just a bunch of random actions. You're going to see it as all unified by the fact that it's part of this larger story with a plot and a hero and dialogue and actions that are intelligible in the context of the setting and the history and so forth, right? And so that's really what we need for the unity of a human life. We need to take all these different actions and relationships and see it as a novel, as a story, the story of our lives. And then nothing is just this random discrete thing. I can't just be, the professor for part of the day and the home life guy. It's the story of my life where I go to work and then I come home and these different things happen. But if we're really going to kind of understand that, we need to understand a little bit more about, well, what is the genre of a human life? And what he wants to say is that it's a kind of a narrative quest, and that we really get this unity of the human life by seeing it as a kind of a quest story. So he says this on page 309, second full paragraph. Right? It is now, this is a really big paragraph for the whole thing here. It is now possible to return to the question from which this inquiry into the nature of human action and identity started. In what does the unity of an individual life consist? The answer is that its unity is the unity of a narrative embodied in a single life, that it is unified by the fact that that single life is itself a kind of whole unified narrative. To ask, what is the good for me, is to ask how best I might live out that unity and bring it to completion. And so a couple of lines down there, he says, the unity of a human life is the unity of a narrative quest. Okay? So he is identifying a literary genre, the quest story. So, famous examples are things like Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, where the knight from King Arthur's court goes on a quest to achieve some good. And that's what unifies all his actions. That's what makes sense of all that, right? And what he wants to say is that our lives are stories and they are quests as well. And so everything that we do is unified by the fact that it's all ultimately part of this single quest of this single person. That's the story that unifies all that stuff that you do. And so what is that a quest for, he says, for, Sir Gawain, it was the Green Knight, and there was a dragon, and there was maybe the Holy Grail. It's been a while since I read that, right? But if it's a quest story, then we need to know what the object of the quest is. And on page 310, that first full paragraph, about 2/3 of the way down, a little under half, I guess, we have then arrived at a provisional conclusion about the good life for man. The good life for man is the life spent in seeking for the good life for man. And the virtues necessary for the seeking are those that will enable us to understand what more and what else the good life is for man. In other words, the good life is simply the quest for the good life. His idea of the good life being this kind of unified human whole is going to be achieved by seeing your life as a narrative, a story, specifically a quest story. A quest for what? The good life itself. That each of us is on a quest to achieve the good life. And that the good life is really simply actively engaging in that quest for the good life. So this is the Aristotelian influence there, right? He's using this phrase, the good life. Aristotle said happiness, right? But it's still that idea that everything we do is for that ultimate end of happiness. Well, everything we do is for this ultimate end of the good life. And his claim is that the good life is simply living a good faith, active pursuit of the good life, not wasting your life, but trying to live a good life as good as possible. And that is where those virtues come in, because all those virtues that Aristotle talked about, courage, honesty, generosity, those are the sorts of things that will promote that quest, that make us more successful on that quest. Now, again, this is one of those things that worries me a little bit, because it sounds like those cliches you've heard before. Like the good life is the quest for the good life. It's not the journey, it's not the destination, it's the journey, that kind of thing. He is saying that, but not as just a cliche. The problem with hearing that as a cliche is that once it's a cliche, critical thinking disappears. It's like, oh, everybody always says this all the time, so it must be true, and we all clearly understand what it means, but is it true, right? The critical thinking is asking, well, is that true? Identifying and critiquing our assumptions, even if we end up agreeing with them. And clarifying the concepts. Well, what do you mean by the journey and the destination? So he agrees with that, but he's actually giving arguments and reasons to show why that's true, rather than just writing a bumper sticker instead of a book. Right? So he agrees it is the journey, not the destination in a sense, but it's the journey to try to achieve the good life, and we really need the virtues to do that. Now, these last couple of pages are where he finally talks about this idea of tradition and why traditions are important. Excuse me a second. What he wants to say in these few pages is that the story of any particular human life is embedded in its communities and their histories. So this is page 311, the last half dozen lines of the first big paragraph there. For the story of my life is always embedded in the story of those communities from which I derive my identity. I am born with a past, and to try to cut myself off from that past in the individualist mode is to deform my present relationships. The possession of a historical identity and the possession of a social identity coincide. So this is, again, where we think of ourselves as a narrative. It's like when you learn about stories and you learn about characters, you also need to learn about the setting and the backstory. So too, we are not these isolated individuals. This is very Aristotelian as well. We kind of live out our lives in a social context. So I have to take into account that whether I like it or not, or whether I'm happy about it or not, I am born to a certain community that has a literal history to it, like in the taking a history class kind of way. And that provides a certain foundation for my identity. Whether good or bad, whether I want to accept it or reject it, I cannot ignore the fact that I am born to communities that have a shared history, and that makes up a large part of who I am, for good or ill. And so on 312, he says that we are part of a history and therefore bearers of certain traditions, like it or not. Right? 312, very top there. Right, second sentence. I find myself part of a history, and that is generally to say, whether I like it or not, whether I recognize it or not, one of the bearers of a tradition. Excuse me, a little tickle in my throat here. But like it or not, that's required for that idea of the intelligibility of our actions again, that he goes on to say there on 313 near the top. A living tradition is then a historically extended, socially embodied argument, and an argument precisely in part about the goods which constitute that tradition. And so what he's going on to say here is that the traditions provide the kind of the history part of the context that's required to understand the narrative of a life. So just like when you're reading a novel that takes place in 19th century Russia, which you're not familiar with, and it's a long time ago compared to you, you need your English teacher or Russian teacher, if you're reading it in the original, teaches you a little something about the community, and that also includes the history and the traditions. So too, traditions are really important. And so one of the things that he's arguing for is that contrary to a lot of modern individualism, which thinks of traditions as being kind of irrelevant, he thinks that we really do need to pay very close attention to traditions for good or ill. It doesn't mean they're always good, right? Some traditions can be bad too, but we need to be kind of constantly aware of this because that's our backstory and that's part of the setting and the context of our story. And we can't write the story of our own lives without understanding that stuff. So not only do we need virtues, but we need close attention to the idea of tradition for us to engage on that narrative quest for the good life, which provides the unity of my life, that lets me see all those things that I do is actually being related to some greater whole, a greater whole life and a greater whole person. This is a really kind of a neat article to wrap up the semester with, in a way, right? Because our big theme is this idea of the good life, and we've kind of come full circle talking about that by saying that the good life is just actively and virtuously engaging in the hunt for, the search for the good life, and leaving open the idea that maybe that could be a little bit different from person to person, but it's also clearly not an anything goes kind of thing. He thinks we need those virtues and those traditions to make that work. Yeah, neat stuff. Think about this one. We got some cool discussion questions here. And as always, let me know if you have any questions about the content. Thanks.